The kitchen smelled like pine resin and wood smoke, the way it always did before dawn, when the stone walls still held the cold of the night, and the fire I'd coaxed to life an hour earlier hadn't yet won its quiet battle against the dark. I liked that hour, the one before anyone else woke, the one that belonged entirely to me. I pressed my palms flat against the wooden work table and breathed it in. The yeast rising in the clay bowl to my left, the sharp sweetness of dried herbs bundled overhead, the faint mineral scent of the iron pots soaking in the basin. This was my domain. Not by title, not by blood, not by any of the laws that governed every other corner of Ashvale Keep. Just by habit, by stubbornness, and by the simple fact that I had outlasted every other cook who'd tried to hold this position. My name is Willa. I am 24 years old, the sole human employed in a household of wolves, and I have learned, slowly, painfully, and through more mistakes than I care to count, that invisibility is not the same as safety. It just feels that way, until it doesn't. I pulled my blonde braid over one shoulder and began sorting through the morning's supplies. Bread first, then the broth for the patrol warriors who'd be returning before sunrise, cold-skinned and sharp-tempered after a night on the northern border. Then the Alpha King's breakfast, which had to be precise, because everything about him was precise. And the one time I'd served his eggs with the yolk broken. The look he'd given me had lasted 3 full seconds longer than comfort allowed. Aiden. I said his name inside my head the way you press a bruise, not to enjoy the pain, but to remind yourself it's real. He was not cruel. That was the thing people outside the keep never understood. They imagined an Alpha King as something wild and snarling, all fury and teeth. But Aiden was something far more unnerving than that. He was contained, every word measured, every glance deliberate. He moved through his own halls like a man who had already calculated the weight of every room before entering it, and nothing seemed to catch him off guard. Except, occasionally, me. Not because I was remarkable. I want to make that clear. I was plain in the way that honest things are plain. No artifice, no performance. Just the face I'd been born with, pale and flushed at the cheeks, with light eyes that my mother once said looked like shallow river water. I was not the kind of woman who stopped conversations. I was the kind who refilled cups without being noticed. But I had a habit of saying things out loud that others kept to themselves. It wasn't bravery. It was a flaw I'd been trying to correct for years. The kitchen door swung open. I didn't flinch. I'd learned to stop flinching at sudden sounds, because in a house full of wolves, sudden sounds were simply Tuesday. It was Petra, one of the household betas, 26 and already carrying the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that came from managing schedules for creatures who treated time as a suggestion. She dropped a stack of parchment onto the corner of my work table without ceremony. "Menu changes," she said, reaching past me for the kettle. "The king wants dinner pushed to the eastern hall tonight. Formal setting." I raised an eyebrow but didn't stop kneading. Formal setting on a Thursday. He's having a guest. What kind of guest? Petra poured her tea with the careful focus of someone who had already decided not to elaborate. I watched the steam curl upward between us and understood that the silence itself was information. "A female guest," I concluded. "A female alpha," Petra said. And she looked at me then, briefly, with an expression I couldn't quite classify. Something between apology and assessment. "From the Valdris territory. Her name is Isolde. She arrives this afternoon." I turned back to my bread. "Noted," I said. "I'll adjust the menu. Does she have dietary requirements?" "Not that I've been informed of." Petra wrapped both hands around her mug. "Willa." She's... The council has been suggesting he formalize an alliance, through marriage." My hands kept moving. The dough was smooth now, elastic under my palms, and I focused on that. The texture. The resistance. "That's not really my area," I said. I know. I just thought you should... Petra. I looked up, kept my voice level and my face neutral, the way I'd practiced. I'm the cook. I'll make a dinner that honors the occasion. That's what I'm here for. She nodded once and left. The kitchen settled back into its familiar quiet. Somewhere outside, the first birds were beginning their tentative conversation with the coming light, and the fire crackled and popped like it was listening. I went back to work. By midday, the keep had a different energy. I felt it the way you feel a change in weather, not through any single sign, but through accumulation. The guards stood straighter. The younger wolves moved faster, their voices lower. Even the light seemed to shift, the gray autumn sky pressing down more deliberately against the stone. Isolde arrived at the 3rd hour after noon. I was crossing the inner courtyard with a basket of root vegetables when the gates opened, and I stopped without meaning to. She came in on horseback, a gray mare, which was either a coincidence or a statement. And she was exactly what I would have designed if I'd been trying to build the opposite of myself. Tall, dark-haired, the kind of compose that didn't read as calm, but as power held on a very short leash. She wore no armor, but she didn't need to. Her posture was armor enough. And Aiden was there to meet her. I had seen him hundreds of times, had served his meals, had been in the same room during councils and disputes, and the quiet hours when he sat in the library with maps spread across every surface and that particular line between his brows that meant he was solving something the rest of the world hadn't identified as a problem yet. I knew the way he stood. I knew the cadence of his silences. But I had never seen him walk toward someone the way he walked toward Isolde. Not with warmth, exactly, but with a kind of grave attention that felt significant. He held out his hand, and she took it. And the courtyard around them seemed to understand it was witnessing something, and had the decency to be quiet about it. I looked away. My basket was heavy. The parsnips could not wait. Dinner was meticulous. I spent 6 hours on it, 3 courses, everything timed precisely. The sauces reduced to exactly the right weight. The bread baked fresh at the last possible moment so it would still carry warmth to the table. I did not do this for Isolde. I did it because it was my work, and I did not know how to do my work carelessly. Petra came to the kitchen doorway at 8:30 to tell me it had gone well, that Isolde had complimented the meal, that the king had eaten more than usual. Good, I said, and began cleaning. Petra lingered. She'll likely stay a few days, she said. I'll plan accordingly. The king seemed, I don't know, different, more present than he's been in months. I scrubbed the iron pot with more focus than it required. I'm glad for him, I said, and I meant it, mostly, which was the part that made me press my lips together and scrub harder, because I was not supposed to have an opinion about Aiden's moods or the quality of his presence, or whether he seemed more like himself when a striking alpha woman was seated across his dinner table. I was the cook. I was invisible. I had chosen this. Hadn't I? It was Rafe who destroyed everything, as he so often did, without any apparent awareness of having done so. Rafe was 22, a junior pack member assigned to general household duties, constitutionally incapable of subtlety, and one of the only people in the keep who spoke to me with the loose, uncomplicated ease of genuine friendship. He arrived in my kitchen the following morning while I was making porridge, and dropped himself onto the stool by the fire, with the dramatic weight of a man carrying impossible news. You look like you need to tell me something, I said, without turning around. Cassia from the East Wing told me that Fenwick told her that the king asked the council to begin formal consideration. He paused for effect. Of Isolde. I stirred. Fenwick gossips. Fenwick knows things. He's the king's second advisor, Willa. I transferred the porridge to the serving pot, steadied my breathing. Then I suppose it's moving forward. Doesn't that... Rafe stopped himself. which was unusual enough that I turned to look at him. He was watching me with an expression too careful for his years. "Never mind. Say it. Doesn't it bother you?" The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind pressed against the high windows, and somewhere deep in the keep, someone was moving furniture across stone, the scrape of it traveling through the walls like a slow complaint. "No," I said. And then, because Rafe was looking at me with those clear, uncomplicated eyes, and because I had always been constitutionally incapable of clean, efficient lying, "It's not mine to be bothered by." He opened his mouth. The door swung open. Aiden stood in the frame. He almost never came to the kitchen. In 4 years, I could count the instances on one hand, and each time had carried the same quality, a stillness that arrived before he did, like the room taking a breath. He was in the same dark leather he wore for morning meetings, his braided hair pulled back, those pale blue eyes scanning the space with the unhurried efficiency of someone accustomed to reading environments. They landed on me. "Willa," he said. Not a question, not a greeting exactly. Just my name and his voice, which had the specific and unfair quality of sounding like a decision. "Good morning," I said. My voice was steady. This was something I had practiced. Rafe stood so fast he knocked the stool sideways and mumbled something about needing to check the woodpile. He was gone in under 4 seconds. I noted, not for the first time, that Rafe was a coward. Aiden stepped into the kitchen. He glanced at the porridge pot, at the herbs drying on the line above, at the bread cooling on the rack, taking inventory. He did this everywhere. Collected information with his eyes before he used his mouth. "The dinner last night," he said. "I hope everything was satisfactory." It was. A pause. Isolde appreciated the lamb preparation. "I'm glad." He looked at me. The kind of look that lasted slightly longer than strictly necessary. "You adjusted the menu from what Petra submitted." I did. The original had 2 dishes with overlapping spice profiles. It would have felt repetitive. "You made that decision independently." "I did," I said again. If that was overstepping, I apologize. It wasn't. Another pause. Something moved through his expression. Something brief and unnameable, like a shadow crossing still water. "The dinner was the best we've served this year." I folded my hands in front of me and waited. Because there was something else. I could feel it the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. Aiden did not come to the kitchen to compliment the lamb. "I'll need you to plan something more substantial for tomorrow evening," he said. "A gathering. The senior pack members, the visiting delegation, the council. 30 people. I can do that. And Willa." "Yes?" He was already turning toward the door. But he stopped, just for a moment, with his back half turned to me, in the particular way of someone who has said what they came to say and hasn't yet decided whether it was the whole truth. "Don't change the bread," he said quietly. "Keep it the same." And he was gone. I stood in the kitchen for a long moment, listening to the fire and the wind and the distant echo of his footsteps on stone. My hands, when I unfolded them, were perfectly still. My chest was not. The gathering took 2 days to prepare, not 1, because Aiden had, characteristically, mentioned the 30 guests as though it were a minor detail, when in reality it meant coordinating with the storage rooms, the hunting party that needed to be redirected, and Marin, the elderly beta woman who managed the keep's provisions with the iron efficiency of someone who had survived 3 Alpha Kings and had opinions about all of them. Marin did not like changes to her inventory schedule. She arrived at my kitchen door the morning after Aiden's visit with a ledger under one arm and the expression of a woman prepared for war. 30 people, she said by way of greeting. 30 people, I confirmed. By tomorrow evening. By tomorrow evening. She looked at me over the ledger with the particular weariness of someone who respects competence but refuses to admit it out loud. What do you need? We spent an hour at the work table, the ledger open between us, negotiating quantities with the focused intensity of a treaty discussion. Morin gave ground slowly and on her own terms, pushing back on 3 items before conceding them, which was actually her version of generous. By the time she left, I had everything I needed, and something that might generously be called her approval, expressed through the single phrase, "Don't make a mess of it." High praise from Morin. Rafe appeared an hour later, rolled up his sleeves without being asked, and began hauling firewood. This was his way of apologizing for abandoning me to Aiden the day before. I didn't mention it. He didn't mention it. We worked in the comfortable shorthand of people who had spent enough time together to communicate mostly in silence and the occasional well-timed eye roll. Isolde was in the training yard this morning, he said, stacking logs with theatrical nonchalance. She's formidable. Even Cade was watching. Cade was the keep's head warrior, a beta in his mid-30s, who had the emotional expressiveness of carved stone and the combat record of someone genuinely dangerous. If Cade was watching, it meant something. Good for her, I said. Rafe stacked another log, waited. Aiden was watching too. I was chopping carrots. I kept chopping carrots. The knife was steady. The carrots were even. Everything was fine. Rafe, I said pleasantly. Yes. If you're trying to get a reaction from me, I'd like you to know that I've been serving food to apex predators for 4 years without showing fear. I'm very good at keeping my face neutral. He grinned. It was an annoyingly warm grin. I know. That's actually what worries me. By mid-afternoon of the second day, the kitchen was controlled chaos, warm and loud and smelling of roasted meat and reduced wine and the sharp green bite of rosemary. 2 additional helpers had been sent by Petra, a quiet young woman named Sable, who moved through the space with careful efficiency, and an older man called Dorn, who had the slow, methodical energy of someone who had learned long ago that steadiness was more valuable than speed. I directed them with short, clear instructions and worked alongside them without ceremony. This was the thing I was genuinely good at, not the cooking itself, though I was proud of that too, but the orchestration. The knowing what each element needed and when, the awareness of 10 things simultaneously, the ability to hold a complete picture in your head while your hands were occupied with only one part of it. It was, I had sometimes thought in my quieter moments, not entirely unlike what Aiden did. I did not linger on that thought. At the 5th hour, Petra appeared in the doorway with a look that meant something had shifted. I wiped my hands on my apron and went to her. Change of plan, she said quietly, pulling me out of earshot of the others. The council has moved the gathering to the Great Hall. Formal protocol. Aiden wants it treated as a state dinner, not a pack gathering. I stared at her. That's a significant difference. I'm aware. The presentation changes. The order of service changes. I'll need... I know. She pressed her lips together. I'm sorry, Willa. This came from him directly 20 minutes ago. I breathed through it, calculated, reorganized the entire structure in my head within the span of about 15 seconds. A habit born from 4 years of working for a man who made decisions at the speed of his own thinking and occasionally forgot that implementation required time. Tell him I need 1 extra hour on the back end, I said. Petra nodded. She turned to go, then paused. Isolde requested to meet the cook. I blinked. Me? After the dinner, it's not a command. She asked Aiden, apparently, and he said... Petra hesitated. He said it was your choice. That was unexpected. I filed it away. We'll see how the evening goes, I said. The great hall at Ashvale Keep was, in the right light, genuinely beautiful. I had cleaned it, had carried trays through it 100 times, had stood at its periphery during pack ceremonies with my back to the wall and my hands busy. But I had never seen it like this. Candlelit and laid with the dark linens Petra had found somewhere. The long table set for 30, with a precision that transformed the rough stone space into something that felt almost ceremonial. I stood in the service corridor and looked at it through the narrow gap in the door. Aiden sat at the head. Of course. He was in darker clothing than usual. No fur mantle tonight, just the fitted leather and those crossed shoulder straps that he wore like a second skin. His braided hair caught the candlelight. He was speaking to the man on his right, Fenwick, the second advisor, small and precise and perpetually watchful, with the measured focus he gave to anything that required his full intelligence. Isolde sat 3 seats down on his left, close, but not at his side, a deliberate placement. I wondered who had decided it, and what it meant within the particular grammar of wolf hierarchy that I had spent 4 years trying to decode. She looked different in candlelight. Less like a statement, more like a person. She was watching Aiden when he wasn't watching her, and the expression on her face was complex. Something evaluating and something quieter beneath it. Something almost like loneliness. I recognized that look. I stepped back from the door and returned to my kitchen. Service went precisely as planned, which was its own form of satisfaction. Each course arrived on time, at the right temperature, in the right order. Sable moved through the hall like a shadow, efficient and unobtrusive. Dorn managed the back corridor with steady calm. I coordinated everything from the kitchen doorway, watching the rhythm of the room through Sable's brief returns, adjusting the pace of the final course when I sensed the conversation at the table had deepened into something that needed more time. This was the invisible work. The work no one named or thanked or saw. It was only after the final course had been cleared and the guests had dispersed into the hall's quieter corners for conversation that Petra appeared and said softly, "She still wants to meet you." I untied my apron, smoothed my dress. It was a plain thing, gray-brown and practical, and I was suddenly, briefly, aware of it in a way I usually was not. I followed Petra into the hall. Isolde was standing near the tall windows at the far end, a cup in her hand, and she turned when I entered, with the unhurried attention of someone who had been expecting me. Up close. She was perhaps 30, with dark eyes that were far more thoughtful than her imposing presence suggested. "You're Willa," she said. "I am. The lamb last night." She considered her words. "I've eaten in 7 pack territories in the past year. 3 of them had dedicated kitchen staffs of 8 or more. None of them cooked like that." I didn't know what to do with that, so I said, "Thank you," and meant it simply. "You're human," she said, not an accusation. Just a fact being acknowledged. "Yes." She studied me for a moment with that evaluating quiet. "How long have you been here?" 4 years. "And before?" "A smaller territory, further east." I kept my voice even. "I left when the Alpha changed." Something in her expression shifted. A small movement, a softening of the professional composure. She knew what that meant. Territory transitions were rarely gentle for the humans caught within them. "This place suits you," she said, and her tone suggested she meant it as an observation about something more than the kitchen. Before I could respond, I became aware, through the specific quality of stillness that preceded it, that someone had entered the hall behind me. I did not turn immediately. I knew. Aiden stopped a few feet away. He looked at Isolde first, then at me, and there was something in that sequence that I couldn't name precisely. A flicker of something in those pale blue eyes that moved too fast to catch. "Willa," he said, and again it was just my name, delivered with that particular gravity. "The dinner was well received," I said, professional, steady. "I'll take the evening's notes and adjust for any remaining days of the visit." "That's not," He stopped, seemed to reconsider whatever he'd been about to say. His jaw tightened slightly. The bread. Everyone commented on it. The bread, I repeated. Yes. We stood in a small, strange silence, me and the Alpha King, and the visiting Alpha woman who was watching our exchange with an expression of someone reading a document in a language they're still learning, understanding perhaps 70% of it and filing the rest away for later. I should return to the kitchen, I said. You should stay, Aiden said. The words came out flat and immediate, as though they'd bypassed whatever internal filter usually governed him. And the moment after he said them, something shifted in his face. Not regret, exactly, but awareness. The awareness of a man who has revealed more than he intended, and is now deciding whether to claim it or retreat from it. Isolde looked at her cup. I looked at Aiden. I have preparations for tomorrow, I said carefully. He held my gaze for 3 full seconds. Of course, he said finally, and stepped aside. I walked back through the hall at a pace that was neither hurried nor slow, past the candles and the lingering guests, and the maps pinned on the side wall that Aiden was always adding to, and I did not look back. But my heart was doing something I did not have the language for yet. Something that felt, with quiet and inconvenient certainty, like the beginning of a problem. 3 days passed. Isolde remained at the keep, and the rhythm of the household bent around her presence the way water bends around a stone. Not dramatically, not with resistance, but with the quiet inevitability of something adjusting to a new shape. The senior pack members grew comfortable with her at the dinner table. The warriors who had watched her in the training yard began nodding to her in the corridors with the particular respect that competence earns faster than any title. Even Marin, who distrusted newcomers on principle and had once made a visiting beta wait 4 days for a second helping, sent an unsolicited portion of preserved plum to Isolde's chambers. I noted all of this from the kitchen. This was my skill, and I will not pretend otherwise. I was an exceptional observer. 4 years of being the invisible person in a room full of powerful creatures had made me fluent in the language of small signs. A shifted weight. A glance held a second too long. The specific silence between 2 people who have just finished saying something important. Aiden and Isolde met every morning in the Eastern study. Petra confirmed this without my asking, which meant she thought I needed to know, which meant she was watching me watch the situation, which I found mildly humiliating, but also, given Petra's general economy with concern, oddly touching. It's formal, Petra said one morning, refilling her tea at my work table. The meetings. All council protocol. Fenwick is present for everyone. That's appropriate, I said. You don't have to do that, she said. Do what? Perform, not caring. I looked at her. She looked back with the patience of someone who had managed the emotional landscape of a pack household for 11 years and had seen most varieties of human self-deception. I'm not performing anything, I said. I'm the cook. You keep saying that, because it keeps being true. Petra set down her cup with a small, definitive sound. Willa, he asked where you were yesterday, when you weren't in the kitchen at your usual time. I had been in the storage cellar taking inventory, a perfectly ordinary errand. What did you tell him? I asked. The truth. She picked up her cup again. He didn't say anything, but he stayed in the kitchen doorway for about 10 seconds before he left, which for Aiden is approximately the equivalent of pacing the room. I turned back to my bread. My hands moved. My mind was elsewhere. It was Rafe, inevitably, who said the thing out loud that everyone else was carefully not saying. He had taken to spending his afternoon breaks in the kitchen, ostensibly helping, actually perching on his stool, and narrating the keep's social politics with the enthusiastic authority of someone who gathered information through sheer ubiquity. He was everywhere, noticed by no one important, and retained everything. Fenwick told Cade that the council is pushing for a decision before the month ends, he said, on the 4th afternoon of Isolde's visit. Formal proposal, alliance marriage, the whole protocol. I was reducing a sauce. I did not look up. That's been the direction for weeks. Yes, but... Rafe shifted on his stool. There's a complication. What kind? The kind that keeps going to the kitchen doorway and standing there for 10 seconds. I set down my spoon, turned around. Rafe was watching me with that careful, gentle expression he occasionally produced when he remembered he was capable of seriousness. He was young, but he wasn't foolish, and in this moment, he looked neither young nor foolish. I don't know what you want me to say, I said. I don't want you to say anything. I want you to... He paused, searching for the word. I want you to stop disappearing. I'm right here. You know what I mean. He looked at his hands, then back at me. Every time he gets close, you find a reason to step back. The cellar, the pantry, the north garden. You're very busy when it matters. The kitchen was warm. Outside, the late afternoon light was going golden and thin, the kind of autumn light that made everything look like it was already becoming a memory. He's considering a formal alliance with a woman who is his equal in every way that matters in this world, I said quietly. She's an alpha. She understands what he carries. She can stand beside him in ways that I stopped, pressed my lips together. I'm not disappearing, Rafe. I'm being realistic. He doesn't look at her the way he looks at you. You don't know what you're seeing. I'm 22, not 12. There was a quiet firmness in his voice that surprised me. I know what I'm seeing. I picked up my spoon. The sauce needed attention. It doesn't matter, I said, and this time I almost believed it. On the 5th day, Isolde found me in the kitchen garden. I went there in the early evenings when the day's work was winding down. Not because there was always something to harvest, but because the garden was the one place at the keep that felt genuinely neutral. No hierarchy, no protocol, just cold soil and the smell of late-season thyme, and the satisfaction of tending something that grew at its own pace, regardless of pack politics. She came around the side wall quietly, which for a woman of her presence was an impressive feat. I heard her anyway. I had learned to hear everything, and looked up from where I was crouched over a row of winter herbs. I'm not interrupting? She asked. No, I said, and meant it. She crouched beside me with the easy physicality of someone comfortable in any terrain, and looked at the herb rows with apparent genuine interest. You grow your own. When I can. The kitchen garden was neglected when I arrived. It took about a year to bring it back. You've been here 4 years. She touched a sprig of rosemary lightly. You built something. It's a garden. It's more than that. She was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the low hedges at the garden's edge. Can I ask you something directly? I sat back on my heels and looked at her. You can. Are you in love with him? The question arrived without cruelty and without particular drama. Just the clean directness of someone who had decided that honesty was more respectful than navigation. I found, to my slight surprise, that I was not angry. I was something closer to tired, and something closer to relieved, because it turned out there was a specific exhaustion that came from carrying a feeling you had refused to name even to yourself. I don't know, I said finally. It was the most honest answer I had. Isolde nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something. He talks about you, she said. Not in any way that would give the council cause for concern. Just, you appear in his sentences unexpectedly. The bread. A decision you made about a menu. Something you said 3 weeks ago that he's still thinking about. A brief pause. Men like Aiden don't retain things unless they matter. I looked at the rosemary, at the dark soil between the rows, at my own hands, cold and faintly stained from the herbs. It doesn't change anything, I said. Why not? because what I am and what he is are— Don't, she said, not unkindly but firmly. Don't give me the speech about human and wolf. I've heard it. It's usually given by people who've already decided to be afraid. She stood, brushing her hands together. I'm not going to pretend there aren't complications. There are. But I've been watching you for 5 days, Willa. And I think the biggest complication is that you've convinced yourself that stepping back is the same as being wise. She left before I could answer. I stayed in the garden until the light was nearly gone. That night, I could not sleep. This was not unusual. I had always been a light and fitful sleeper, prone to the specific wakefulness that arrives at the second hour after midnight and refuses to negotiate. Normally, I used it productively, going to the kitchen to begin the first prep of the morning, letting the familiar work settle my mind back into something manageable. I wrapped myself in my gray cloak and went through the servants' corridor toward the kitchen. I did not expect the library to have light under its door. I stopped in the corridor, told myself to keep walking, listened to myself tell myself that, and then stood completely still, because the truth was that I had spent 4 years practicing discipline in this building, and there were apparently limits. I knocked. A pause. Then, "Come in." Aiden was at his desk, surrounded by maps in the way he always was at this hour. I knew his sleepless patterns the way I knew the kitchen's cold spots and the garden's drainage issues through years of quiet observation. He looked up when I entered, and something in his expression shifted in that fast, unguarded way that I had seen only a handful of times, the way it had shifted in the great hall when he'd told me to stay. Willa. No surprise in his voice. Something else. I saw the light, I said, as though that explained anything. Sit down, he said, and then immediately, as though correcting himself, if you want to. I sat in the leather chair across from his desk. The fire was low but present, and the maps covered every surface, new territories I didn't recognize, borders being redrawn, the complicated geography of a world that was always in the process of renegotiating itself. We were quiet for a moment. It was the particular quiet of two people who have things to say and are deciding in real time which of those things are safe. Isolde is leaving the day after tomorrow, he said. I looked at the fire. The council won't be pleased. The council rarely is. A pause. She told me she's declining the formal proposal. My heart did something abrupt and involuntary. She said— He stopped, looked at his maps, looked back at me. She said she appreciated the visit, but that she had a sense the relevant question wasn't whether she and I were strategically compatible. What was the relevant question? My voice was steady. I was very good at steady. Aiden was quiet for a long moment. The fire settled. The wind pressed against the high library windows. She said I should ask my cook, he said. The room felt suddenly very still, not the cold stillness of an empty place, but the warm, weighted stillness of a moment that has been accumulating for a long time and has finally decided to arrive. I looked at him. He looked at me. And for once, neither of us reached for the professional distance we had both, carefully for 4 years, kept firmly between us. I have a date tonight, I said. The words came out before I could stop them. Not from bravery, not from planning, but from that flaw of mine, the one that bypassed every reasonable filter. My own voice surprised me, low and uncertain and almost amused, because it was the most absurd thing I had ever said in this building, and I had no idea where it had come from. Aiden stared at me. For the first time in 4 years, something I had said had genuinely, completely, and visibly caught him off guard. He went absolutely still. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the kind of silence that has texture, dense and warm and slightly precarious, like the moment before something shifts its weight and becomes something else entirely. Aiden's stillness was different from his usual contained composure. His usual stillness was deliberate, the product of discipline and authority and years of being the most powerful person in every room he entered. This was something else. This was a man who had been caught without his armor. His eyes moved across my face with an intensity that made my skin feel too aware of itself. "A date," he repeated, flat, careful, like a man testing ice. "A date," I confirmed, because I had apparently committed to this, and there was no graceful exit. "With whom?" It was not quite a question. The absence of the question's inflection made it something more complicated, something that lived in the narrow space between inquiry and something that did not yet have a polite name. "That's—" I stopped, steadied. "That's not really relevant. It's relevant to me." 3 words, quiet and direct, and carrying a weight that rearranged the air in the room. I felt it in my sternum, that specific pressure of something arriving that you have been carefully, methodically, deliberately not allowing yourself to expect. I looked at him. He looked at me. The fire made small sounds between us. "Why?" I asked. He stood up. This was a thing Aiden did when a conversation required more than his desk could contain. He moved, not pacing, not restless, but with the deliberate physicality of someone thinking through their body as well as their mind. He came around the desk slowly, not toward me exactly, just into the space, and stopped near the edge of the map table, close enough that I could see the specific quality of the expression he was wearing. I had catalogued his expressions over 4 years. This one I had seen only fragments of, usually gone before I could name it, replaced quickly by the composed authority he defaulted to. But here, at the 2nd hour after midnight, in a library that held no audience and no protocol, he was apparently done replacing it. "Because," he said, and then paused with the particular pause of a man choosing precision over speed. "I have spent 4 years watching you move through this household with more clarity and more quiet courage than most of my senior pack members, and somewhere in those 4 years I stopped thinking of you as my cook." The room was very quiet. "What did you start thinking of me as?" My voice came out smaller than I intended. He looked at me steadily. "Mine." The word landed with the simplicity of something that had always been true, and was only now being said aloud. Not possessive in the way of dominance. I knew the difference. I had spent 4 years learning the difference, but in the way of recognition. The way you say home and mean not a place, but a feeling of rightness. My hands were folded in my lap. I made myself keep them there. "Aiden," I said carefully. 2 days ago you were sitting across a formal dinner table from a woman the council has selected as your ideal match. She is an alpha. She leads her own territory. She is not you. That is precisely the problem from a strategic standpoint. I'm aware of the strategic standpoint." Something moved through his expression. Not frustration exactly, but the concentrated energy of a man who has been patient for a very long time and is now choosing a different approach. "I've been aware of the strategic standpoint for 4 years, Willa. I've been aware of every reason why the conversation I'm having right now is impractical. I've had it outlined for me by Fenwick no fewer than 6 times. A pause. "I've also had it outlined for me by the way you look when you think no one is watching." I went still. "You look—" He stopped. Chose his words with unusual care. "You look like someone who has decided that wanting things she cannot have is a habit worth breaking. And I have been watching you practice not wanting for long enough that it has become—" Another pause. This one weighted differently. Difficult to continue respecting the effort. The fire settled. Outside, the autumn wind moved through the keep's high corners, and somewhere far below in the courtyard, a night watchman's footsteps crossed the stones at their steady, unhurried pace. The sound of the world continuing its ordinary business, while something not at all ordinary was happening in this library. You said you have a date, Aiden said quietly. And there it was again. That note beneath the words. The one without a polite name. Is that true? I looked at him for a long moment. No, I said. It came out before I could stop it. I say things before I can stop them. You know this about me. Something shifted in his face. The line of his shoulders changed. Barely perceptible, but I was fluent in his particular physical language by now, and I knew what the small release of held tension looked like. I do know this about you, he said. I find it disruptive, I offered. Necessary, he said. I did not stay in the library much longer that night. Not because I wanted to leave. There was something in that room, in that hour, that I would have been glad to stay inside indefinitely. But because I was aware, with the specific awareness of someone who has been careful for a very long time, that this conversation had already crossed several significant thresholds, and that crossing any more of them at midnight without the daylight to make sense of them was a particular kind of risk I was not yet ready for. I stood up. He didn't move to stop me, which was its own kind of courtesy. I need to think, I said. Take the time you need, he said. And then, quietly, but Willa. I stopped at the door. Don't practice not wanting, he said. Not anymore. I did not sleep at all after that. I sat in my kitchen in the dark with a cold cup of tea that I had made and forgotten, and I thought about all the careful structures I had built over 4 years. The invisibility, the professionalism, the habit of stepping back, which Rafe had named so precisely, the way I found reasons to be in the cellar, the pantry, the garden, anywhere that wasn't the particular radius where things became complicated and warm and real. I had built those structures for reasons that were not irrational. I knew what I was, human, common, without rank or bloodline or the kind of power that made you legible in a world organized around dominance and hierarchy. I had watched other humans in pack territories try to matter to people far above their station, and I had watched the particular way that story usually ended, which was quietly and without ceremony, and with a specific kind of damage that took years to recover from. But I had also, and this was the thing I had been least honest with myself about, watched Aiden for 4 years. Not with longing, or not only with longing, with attention. The genuine, sustained, involuntary attention you give to something that interests you past the point of choice. I knew the way he read maps, moving his finger along borders while his eyes tracked several steps ahead. I knew he ate methodically, saving what he liked best for last, which was a habit that struck me as quietly revealing the first time I noticed it. I knew he was harder on himself than on anyone beneath him, that he held his own failures to a standard he did not apply to others, that the scar along his left forearm was 3 years old and had come from a border dispute he never discussed, but that Kate had once mentioned to Rafe in a context that made its way, as things did, back to my kitchen. I knew he was lonely, not in the way of someone without people. He was surrounded by people, sustained by loyalty and structure and the dense social fabric of pack life. But in the way of someone who had spent so long being the most responsible person in every room that the inside of his own head had become a very quiet, very solitary place. I recognized that loneliness the way you recognize a landscape you grew up in. Morning came gray and cold, the kind of morning that smells like iron and coming rain. I started the fire and began the bread and let the work do what it always did, which was settle the noise in my head into something manageable. Rafe arrived at his usual time, took one look at me, and said nothing, which meant he understood that whatever had happened was too significant for his usual commentary. He simply took up his position and began his work, and I was grateful for him in a way that I made a mental note to actually say out loud at some point. Isolde came to the kitchen at mid-morning. She was dressed for travel, her dark hair braided back, a leather pack already over one shoulder. She stood in the doorway with the self-possessed ease of a woman who never arrived anywhere without having already considered why she was there. "I'm leaving within the hour," she said. I'll have something packed for the road, I said immediately, turning to the counter. Willa. Her voice was gentle but direct. He's not going to propose to me. I kept my hands moving. I know, he told me. And? I turned to look at her. She was watching me with those thoughtful dark eyes, and there was something in her expression that surprised me. Warmth, genuine and uncomplicated. The warmth of someone who has taken a measure of a situation and arrived at something close to hope. I don't entirely know yet, I said honestly. She nodded, as though this was a reasonable and complete answer. He needs someone who will say the true thing before they can stop themselves, she said. It turns out those people are rare in a king's household. A small, dry smile. I suspect you know this. I've been told it's a flaw, I said. By whom? By most people, at various points. Most people, she said, moving to go, are wrong. She paused at the door. Thank you for the food, Willa. All of it. The dinner, the bread. She looked at me with a quiet precision. Take care of this place. It's worth more than you've let yourself believe. She was gone before I could decide what she meant. The keep, or myself, or some third thing she had left deliberately unnamed. The rain arrived by afternoon, settling over the keep, with a steady, purposeful weight that muffled the courtyards and made the corridors feel closer, the rooms warmer, the whole stone structure more interior than usual. It was the kind of rain that changed the pace of things, slowed them, softened them, pulled them inward. I was finishing the afternoon prep when I heard his footsteps in the corridor. I knew them the same way I knew every recurring sound in the building, by their particular rhythm, their particular weight on stone. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. I did not turn around immediately. I took a breath, finished what my hands were doing, set down my knife with the quiet deliberateness of someone who has made a decision, and turned. Aiden was standing in the doorway with rain on his shoulders and an expression I had never seen on him before, uncertain, in the way of someone who has done the brave thing and is now standing on the other side of it without a map. It was, of all the things I had seen on his face across 4 years, the one that undid me entirely. I believe, I said, before I could stop myself, that you were going to ask me something. He looked at me across the warm kitchen, and for the first time in 4 years, Aiden, the Alpha King of Ashvale Keep, the most contained man I had ever known, smiled. He crossed the kitchen. Not quickly. Nothing about Aiden was ever rushed, and this was no exception. He moved with that same deliberate weight he brought to everything, except that something in it had changed, the way a familiar piece of music changes when played in a different key. The same structure, the same cadence, but resonating differently. Deeper. He stopped on the other side of the work table, close enough that I could see the rain still caught in his braided hair, the specific blue of his eyes in the kitchen's warm light. I stayed where I was, hands at my sides, not retreating, not for once retreating. I want to ask you something, he said. But I want to ask it correctly. You don't have to be precise with me, I said. I'm not the council. Something moved through his expression. Not quite a smile, but the precursor to one. The shift in the muscles around his eyes that I had catalogued over years, and that meant he was genuinely, if briefly, amused. No, he said. You're considerably more difficult than the council. I've been told that's a flaw. You've been told a number of things that are wrong. He looked at me steadily. I'd like to correct that record. If you'll let me. I breathed. The kitchen smelled like rain coming through the high window above the basin, mixing with wood smoke and yeast and the herbs drying overhead. It smelled like every morning I had spent in this room. 4 years of ordinary faithful mornings. And it smelled like something new layered over all of them. Ask, I said. Will you stop hiding in the cellar? He said, when I come looking for you. It was not what I expected. It was better than what I expected. Specific and honest, and so precisely observed that it landed somewhere past my sternum and stayed there. "That depends," I said, "on what you intend to do when you find me." "Talk to you," he said. "Eat your bread. Sit in the same room with you without either of us pretending we are only what our titles say we are." A pause. "Start there." "And where does it go from there?" "Wherever you choose." His voice was very quiet. "That part is yours." I looked at him for a long moment. At the contained, serious, occasionally unnerving man who had walked into my kitchen 4 years ago and said the eggs needed more salt and had never once, in all the time since, treated me as though I were invisible. I had told myself he simply noticed everything, that it was a quality of his attention that had nothing to do with me specifically. I had been, as it turned out, considerably wrong. "All right," I said. He held my gaze. "All right." "Don't make it significant," I said. "It's a simple word." "Nothing you say," he said, with a quiet certainty that made me want to sit down, "is simple." The weeks that followed were not dramatic. I want to be honest about that, because the truth of how things changed between us was not in grand gestures or declarations, or the kind of moments that announce themselves. It was in accumulation. In small things, said and done and repeated until they became a new pattern. He came to the kitchen in the mornings, not every morning, but often enough that Rafe stopped reacting with theatrical surprise and simply moved to make room. He would sit at the corner of the work table, not in Rafe's stool. He never took Rafe's stool, which I noticed and appreciated, with a cup of whatever I had made, and he would read whatever document required his attention that day, and I would work, and we would talk in the spaces between, in the way of people who have discovered that conversation between them is not an effort, but a relief. He told me things. Not everything. He was still Aiden, still the most private person I had ever known. But things. About the border situation in the north that had been troubling him for months. About the council member, Old Harwick, whose health was declining and whose absence from the table would shift the political balance in ways that required planning. About the territory maps and what he was trying to build, not just hold, in Ashvale. I told him things too. About the kitchen and the garden and the small ongoing negotiations with Marin. About the village I had come from, further east, the one I had left at 20 when the old Alpha passed and his successor had a different vision of what the territory's human residents were for. I had not spoken about that to anyone at the keep, not directly, not with the specific words. I had referenced it the way you reference a scar, acknowledging its existence without narrating the event. With Aiden, I narrated the event. He listened the way he did everything, completely, without interrupting, with those pale blue eyes steady on my face. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You were 22 when you came here. 23 by the time I arrived. It took a while. And you built the kitchen garden in the first year. It needed doing." He looked at me with that expression, the one I was learning to read as his version of open, the closest his face came to showing the thing behind the composure. "You built something permanent," he said, "in a place you weren't sure you could stay." I had never thought of it that way. The accuracy of it moved through me quietly, the way truth does when it arrives in a shape you hadn't expected. "I suppose I did," I said. Fenwick predictably had opinions. He expressed them to Aiden in the Eastern study on a Tuesday morning, with the precise, measured language of a man who had served 3 Alpha Kings and believed strongly in the institutional wisdom accumulated across that tenure. I knew because Aiden told me afterward, with the particular dry brevity of someone reporting facts he found mildly absurd. He said it was unprecedented, Aiden said. "It is unprecedented," I said. He said it would complicate territorial relationships. It might. He said the pack would have questions. They already have questions. Rafe has been answering them with considerable enthusiasm for the past 2 weeks. I handed him a cup. What did you tell Fenwick? Aiden looked into his cup. I told him that in 4 years you had never once given me imprecise information, made a decision based on self-interest, or failed to tell me something I needed to hear because it was uncomfortable. He paused. I told him those qualities were rarer than bloodline, and that I was done pretending otherwise. I was quiet for a moment. That was well said, I offered. I've been working on it for approximately 3 years, he said, with perfect seriousness. Cade was the first senior pack member to say something directly to me about it. He found me in the kitchen garden on a gray November morning, stood at the edge of the herb rows with his arms crossed, and regarded me for a long moment with the expressionlessness of a man deciding whether something is a threat. You're not afraid of him, he said finally. Not an accusation, an observation. I'm appropriately cautious, I said, because it was true. That's not the same thing. No, I agreed. Cade was quiet for another moment. The wind moved between us, carrying the smell of turned earth and distant wood fires. He's better, he said then, gruffly and with the visible effort of a man unaccustomed to discussing feelings. Since He stopped. Tried again. He sleeps. He didn't used to sleep properly. Now he does. I looked at the rosemary, felt something quiet and enormous settle in my chest. Good, I said. Cade nodded once, sharply, as though the matter was now closed. He walked back across the courtyard without another word. It was, from Cade, something very close to a blessing. The pack's adjustment was gradual and not without friction. There were members, 2 of the older betas, and 1 of the junior warriors who had apparently harbored his own hopes regarding Aiden's eventual choice, who made their discomfort known in the particular way of wolf hierarchy, which was not through confrontation, but through subtle shifts of acknowledgement. A glance withheld, a greeting delayed, the specific social temperature of people performing indifference. I noticed. I did not perform not noticing, which was a small but significant departure from my usual habits. What changed it was a council session. I was not present. I was, as always, in the kitchen. But Rafe was, because Rafe had a gift for being in rooms where things happened without anyone quite registering how he had gotten there. He reported back with unusual seriousness. The session had been about the northern border issue, which had escalated while Aiden was navigating the situation with Isolde and the council's marriage proposal. A beta from a neighboring territory had been pushing boundaries, testing response times, the particular behavior of someone calculating whether Ashvale's attention was divided. Aiden had presented the situation to the assembled pack with the maps he'd been working on for weeks, and the strategy he laid out, patient, layered, 3 steps ahead and accounting for variables that most of the room hadn't considered, had been developed, Rafe told me, in large part through the conversations Aiden had been having every morning at the kitchen work table. He said so, Rafe said, in front of everyone. He said he'd been working through the problem out loud, and that having someone who asked questions from outside the pack structure had clarified his thinking. I stared at him. He said that in the session, in front of Fenwick and Harwick and Cade and the whole assembled senior pack. Rafe looked almost awed. Fenwick's face did something I have never seen it do before. I thought about Aiden, standing in front of his maps, saying that. Saying it plainly, without drama, in the way he did everything. Not as a declaration, but as a fact he had decided to stop omitting. The temperature shifted after that. Not immediately, not completely. But the subtle indifference became less deliberate. The withheld acknowledgments began to return. What Aiden had done, I understood, was translate me into a language the pack could recognize, not as a sentiment, but as a function. As someone who had been part of the thinking, part of the work, for longer than any of them had known. It was perhaps the most Aiden way possible of saying what he had not said in front of anyone. Winter came early to Asheville. The first real snow arrived on a Thursday, which I noted because Thursday was bread day, and the cold changed the rising time, and I had to adjust accordingly. By mid-morning, the courtyard was white, and the kitchen windows were fogged with warmth, and the whole keep had pulled itself inward with the particular coziness of a place that knows how to survive winter and is not afraid of it. Aiden came to the kitchen at his now usual time, shaking snow from his shoulders, and sat at his corner of the work table. Rafe was there, and Sable, who had become a permanent fixture in the kitchen by quiet and mutual agreement, and Dorn, who came 3 mornings a week and never said much, but whose steadiness I had come to rely on more than I'd expected. The kitchen was full, warm, and loud in its ordinary way, and Aiden sat in the middle of all of it with his document and his cup, and no one performed anything in particular about the fact of him being there, because it had become, over the months, simply a fact. He looked up once, across the room, and found me where I was standing at the fire, and that look passed between us. The particular, quiet, uncomplicated look of 2 people who have found their way to the same place from very different directions and have decided together to stay. I turned back to the bread. My hands were steady. My chest was full, not with the tense, pressurized feeling of something I was trying not to want, but with the open, unhurried warmth of something I had let myself have. I want to tell you where we all ended up, because a story deserves that honesty. Rafe was given a formal household role by midwinter, junior household coordinator, reporting to Petra, who had lobbied for the appointment with characteristic, quiet efficiency. He was spectacularly good at it. His gift for being everywhere and knowing everything turned out to be a professional asset rather than a character flaw. He remained my closest friend in the keep, and still spent his breaks on the stool by the fire, though now he narrated pack politics with the added authority of someone who was officially part of them. Petra was named head of household before the year's end, a title she had functionally held for years without the formal designation. Aiden gave it to her in a brief private meeting that she described to me afterward in exactly 4 words. It was about time, and then returned to her schedule. Cade remained Cade, which is to say, unchanged on the surface and, beneath it, quietly different in the way of someone who has accepted a new element into a structure they had believed complete. He began, occasionally, to stop by the kitchen garden. He never said much. He developed an unexplained interest in the rosemary. Marin retired in the spring, leaving her ledgers to a successor she had personally selected and trained for 3 years, without telling anyone she was planning to go. Her retirement gift to the kitchen was a reorganization of the storage cellar so thorough and precisely documented that it functioned as a masterpiece of logistical thinking. It was, from Marin, the most profound expression of affection I had ever witnessed. Fenwick adjusted. This was the thing about Fenwick. He was a man of deep institutional loyalty, and his loyalty was ultimately to Asheville and to Aiden. And when it became clear that what was happening in the kitchen every morning was not a disruption to the territory's functioning, but a contribution to it, his careful, precise mind recalibrated. He remained skeptical. He probably always would be. But skepticism, I had learned, was Fenwick's love language, and I had grown genuinely fond of him. And Aiden. Aiden was a man who had spent a long time being alone in the way that capable people are alone. Not through circumstance, but through a kind of efficiency of self that leaves very little room for the inconvenience of being truly known. He had dismantled that efficiency, carefully and deliberately, across 1 year of mornings at a kitchen work table, and what was underneath it was something that surprised me daily in its warmth and its humor and its particular, specific quality of attention that made you feel, not important in the way of power or status, but seen. He was still precise. He was still contained in the way of someone who carried a great deal and had learned to carry it well. He still looked at the maps late into the night and made decisions that the rest of the world hadn't identified as problems yet. But he slept. On the last morning of that first winter, the morning when the light came through the kitchen windows at a new angle, slightly higher, slightly warmer, the first suggestion of something changing. I stood at my work table and felt the shape of my own life, the shape of the thing I had built inside this keep, not by ambition or strategy, but by stubbornness and time, and the refusal to stop tending what was worth tending. Aiden came in from the courtyard, snow still on his shoulders, and crossed the kitchen directly to where I was, and stood beside me without ceremony or announcement. His arm against mine. The quiet weight of him, familiar now, like the smell of wood smoke and yeast and the sound of the fire. "Spring in 3 weeks," he said, looking at the window. "The garden will need work," I said. "I'll help," he said, as though this were obvious. I looked at him. He looked at me. And there was nothing left to practice not wanting, because what I wanted was standing in my kitchen with snow on his shoulders, offering to help with the rosemary, and it was so ordinary and so complete that I had no words for it. Only the bread under my hands, and the fire, and the particular stillness of a place that had become, without my quite noticing the moment it happened, home. Some doors don't announce themselves. They just open, and you walk through. And when you look back, you realize you've been walking toward them for years. That is the whole story. That is all of it. The bread was good that morning. It always was.